The attorney slid a folder across the mahogany table in his downtown office, the sound of paper against wood cutting through the thick silence that had settled over our family meeting. My father Frank tapped the folder with his weathered finger and said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly, "Give everything to Cole." Kelley was never the smart one. My brother Cole couldn't hide his smirk as he leaned back in his leather chair, already savoring his victory before it was officially announced. The attorney, Mr. Peterson, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between my father's confident expression and my frozen face. "She can't handle anything big," my father added, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone he'd used to describe my limitations for the past 32 years. "Cole has the business sense. He understands money. Kelley just doesn't have that kind of mind." The room began to spin slightly as the familiar sting of his words hit me like they always did. Every childhood memory of being compared to my golden brother, every moment of being told I wasn't quite good enough, crashed over me in waves. But something was different this time. Instead of shrinking into myself like usual, I looked directly at my father and smiled. "My name is Kelley Hartman, and before I tell you how any of this started, I need a favor from everyone watching this. Please write in the comments where you're watching from because I want to see how far this story travels. And don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, because what happened next is something I never expected from my own father. This is a story about betrayal, greed, and the kind of evil that hides behind a smile. It's about discovering that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally can be the ones working hardest to keep you down. For 32 years, I believed my father when he told me I wasn't as smart as my brother Cole. I accepted being the disappointment, the one who tried hard but never quite measured up to the family's expectations. What my father didn't know was that while he was busy convincing everyone that I lacked intelligence, I was quietly documenting every lie, every hidden document, and every illegal action he thought no one would ever discover. Some people underestimate others out of ignorance. Others do it deliberately to maintain control. The memory that started my journey toward the truth slammed into me as I sat in that attorney's office. The pattern started when we were kids. I remember the exact moment I realized that nothing I did would ever be good enough for my father. Cole had just brought home a report card with a C+ in algebra, and Dad clapped him on the shoulder like he'd won a Nobel Prize. "That's my boy," Dad said proudly, ruffling Cole's hair. "You really applied yourself this semester. I'm proud of you for working hard." Later that same day, I brought home my report card with straight A's, every subject marked with the highest possible grade. Dad barely glanced at it before tossing it onto the kitchen counter with the junk mail. "Grades don't matter if you don't have common sense, Kelley," he said, not even looking at me. "You think too slow. Cole has natural instincts that can't be taught in school." I was 12 years old, and those words burned themselves into my memory like a brand. From that day forward, no matter what I accomplished academically, Dad found ways to dismiss it while celebrating Cole's mediocre efforts. Cole heard this conversation, and instead of defending me or acknowledging my achievements, he just nodded in agreement with Dad's assessment. That's when I knew I was truly alone in this family. The dinner that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening when I was 28 years old. We were all gathered at Dad's house for one of his monthly family meals, where he liked to hold court and dispense his opinions about our lives. Dad turned to Cole and asked with genuine interest, "So what's your plan for the future? Are you thinking about expanding the business or maybe investing in some property?" Then he turned to me with a completely different expression, one that suggested he was asking out of obligation rather than curiosity. "Kelley, do you even have a future plan? Or are you just going to keep drifting through life without direction?" The contrast in his tone was so obvious that even Cole looked uncomfortable for a moment. I excused myself to the bathroom, needing a moment to collect myself before I said something that would start a fight. As I walked down the hallway, I heard Dad's voice drop to what he probably thought was a whisper. "I worry about her," he said to Cole and my stepmother. "She's just not sharp. Never has been." That's when I started recording family conversations, not to expose them, but to motivate myself to prove him wrong. The workplace dynamics mirrored my family situation in ways that were painfully familiar. At my job in marketing, I had spent 3 months developing a comprehensive campaign for our biggest client, researching demographics and crafting strategies that could revolutionize their brand presence. When the presentation day arrived, my coworker Ben somehow ended up delivering my entire proposal as if it were his original work. The client loved it, praising the innovative approach and creative insights that I had poured my heart into developing. My supervisor patted Ben on the back and said, "This is exactly why we value you, Ben. You just have a natural business instinct that can't be taught. Some people have it, and some people don't." I sat in that conference room watching someone else receive credit for my work while being told I lacked the very skills I had just demonstrated. The same wound that my father had opened years earlier was being reopened in my professional life. That afternoon, I quietly updated my resume and started looking for freelance consulting opportunities where my work would be credited to me alone. If I was going to succeed, it would have to be on my own terms, away from people who were determined to overlook my contributions. I began taking small consulting jobs at night and on weekends, working with local businesses that needed marketing strategies and financial planning assistance. The work was challenging and rewarding, and for the first time in my adult life, I was being recognized for my actual abilities rather than dismissed because of other people's preconceptions. Nobody knew about my side business. Not Dad, not Cole, not even my coworkers who continued to assume I was just an average employee without much ambition or talent. I preferred it that way, building my reputation and savings account in secret. Every penny I earned went into a separate savings account that I had opened specifically for my future independence. I lived modestly on my regular salary while banking everything from my consulting work, watching my financial security grow month by month. One evening, while working on a financial planning project for a small family business, my client handed me a file that contained documentation about estate planning and trust management. As I reviewed the paperwork, something caught my eye that made my blood run cold. The file contained a reference to my grandmother's trust fund, but the details didn't match what my father had told us about her final wishes. My grandmother's trust documents had been altered after her death, and Frank Hartman's signature was all over the changes. The original will, which I found buried in the legal paperwork, told a completely different story than the one my father had shared with our family. According to the original documents, my grandmother had specifically named me, not Cole, as the primary beneficiary of her estate. She had left detailed instructions about her reasoning, explaining that she believed I possessed the intellectual capacity and moral character necessary to manage her legacy responsibly. But the altered documents showed Cole as the sole heir, with my father serving as the executor who would control everything until Cole reached a certain age. The signatures on the alterations were clearly forged, and the dates proved that the changes had been made months after my grandmother's funeral. My hands shook as I photographed every page, understanding that I was holding evidence of fraud that could destroy my father's reputation and land him in prison. The grandmother who had always encouraged my education and praised my curiosity had tried to provide for my future, only to have her wishes stolen by her own son. For the first time in my life, I had concrete proof that my father's treatment of me wasn't based on my actual limitations, but on his own criminal greed. I contacted a lawyer the next morning, choosing someone outside our small town who wouldn't have any connection to my family's local reputation. Attorney Wilson reviewed the documents I had discovered, his expression growing more serious with each page. If your father altered these trust documents illegally, he could face criminal charges, he warned me, setting down the papers with obvious concern. This isn't just about inheritance money. This is fraud, forgery, and potentially tax evasion depending on how he's been managing the estate assets. I sat in his office feeling a mixture of vindication and terror, finally understanding the scope of what my father had done to secure Cole's future at my expense. The original will clearly names you as the primary beneficiary, Attorney Wilson continued. Your grandmother left detailed explanations about her decision, citing your academic achievements and your character. She wanted you to have the resources to build an independent life. He leaned forward, studying my face carefully. But I need to ask you something important. Do you have additional proof beyond these documents? Witnesses, recordings, anything that shows a pattern of deception? I told him honestly, not yet. But I'm working on it. Christmas that year was a performance of cruelty disguised as family tradition. Dad had decorated his house with expensive ornaments and prepared an elaborate dinner, creating the perfect setting for his annual gift-giving ceremony where he demonstrated his favoritism in front of everyone. He handed Cole a thick envelope labeled "To the brilliant Hartman child" with flourish and ceremony, making sure everyone in the room understood the significance of his choice of words. Cole opened the envelope to reveal a check for $10,000 along with a handwritten note from Dad praising his natural business instincts and promising future as the family leader. When it was my turn, Dad handed me nothing. Not a card, not a small gift, not even an acknowledgement that I was part of the family celebration. I sat there in front of relatives and family friends, publicly excluded from my father's version of Christmas generosity. Cole raised his glass of wine and offered a toast that cut through me like a knife. Here's to the one Dad's proud of. Thanks for always believing in me, Dad. Everyone drank to Cole's success while I sat empty-handed, the visible reminder of my father's disappointment in front of people who would spread this story throughout our community. I excused myself to the bathroom where I could finally let the tears fall without giving my father the satisfaction of seeing how deeply his cruelty had affected me. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, watching mascara streak down my cheeks as 30 years of accumulated hurt poured out. But then something inside me shifted, hardened into something I had never felt before. The sadness transformed into determination, the hurt crystallized into resolve. I wiped my tears carefully, fixed my makeup, and whispered to my reflection, they underestimated the wrong daughter. When I returned to the family gathering, I smiled politely and participated in conversations as if nothing had happened. But internally, I was already planning my next moves in a strategy that would expose every lie my father had built his favoritism on. That night, I made a phone call to Attorney Wilson's emergency line and told him I was ready to move forward with investigating the trust alterations. The evidence I needed was going to require more aggressive tactics, but I was finally prepared to fight back. The quiet, dismissed daughter was about to become someone much more dangerous than my father had ever imagined. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mr. Patterson, an elderly accountant who had worked with my father's business for over 20 years, contacted me privately after hearing through mutual acquaintances that I was asking questions about my grandmother's estate. He asked to meet me at a coffee shop across town, away from any location where we might be spotted by people who knew our families. When he arrived, he looked nervous but determined, carrying a briefcase that suggested he had brought more than just conversation. "Your father has been hiding financial documents for years," he told me quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "I've kept copies of everything because I was worried something like this might happen eventually." He opened his briefcase and revealed folders full of bank statements, tax documents, and correspondence that showed a pattern of financial manipulation stretching back to shortly after my grandmother's death. "Frank has been moving money between accounts to hide the true value of the estate," Patterson explained. "He's been paying himself fees as the executor while telling everyone the trust is worth much less than it actually is." The evidence he provided was comprehensive and damning, showing that my father had been stealing from my grandmother's estate for years while publicly positioning himself as the responsible family leader managing a modest inheritance. Cole made a critical mistake on social media that provided me with additional evidence of their conspiracy. He posted a photo of himself at an expensive restaurant with the caption, "Celebrating the good life. Can't wait to inherit everything someday and really live it up." My father commented on the post with obvious approval, "Of course, son. You've earned it with your intelligence and hard work. Some people are born to lead, and others are born to follow." They didn't realize that social media posts create permanent digital records that can be used as evidence in legal proceedings. Cole's bragging about his expected inheritance, combined with Dad's public confirmation of his intentions, created a timeline that would be crucial in court. I screenshot everything before they could delete it, adding these posts to the growing file of evidence that showed their shared assumption that Cole would inherit everything regardless of what my grandmother had actually wanted. The posts also revealed their attitude toward me, with Cole adding in a later comment, "Some family members just don't have what it takes to handle responsibility. Good thing Dad recognizes who's really capable." Their arrogance was creating a digital trail that would eventually destroy their credibility when the truth came out. I spent weeks organizing everything into a comprehensive legal strategy with Attorney Wilson's guidance. We had fake trust alterations, misreported assets, hidden bank accounts, and my grandmother's original will that clearly contradicted everything my father had told our family. The evidence painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning several years, with my father positioning himself as the heroic executor managing a modest estate while actually stealing significant assets that belonged to me according to my grandmother's wishes. This is one of the most clear-cut cases of inheritance fraud I've seen in 20 years of practice, Attorney Wilson told me as we reviewed the final documentation. Your father's alterations are so obvious that any judge will be able to see what happened. We prepared for multiple scenarios, a settlement negotiation where my father might admit wrongdoing in exchange for avoiding criminal charges, or a full court battle where all the evidence would become public record. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Attorney Wilson asked me during our final preparation meeting. Once we file these documents, there's no going back. Your relationship with your family will be permanently changed. My answer was immediate and absolute, absolutely. They've been stealing from me for years while convincing me I was too stupid to deserve better. It's time for the truth. Dad's final insult came during a family barbecue that he hosted for his business associates and their families. He had invited only Cole to attend, making it clear that I wasn't welcome at his celebration of professional success and family pride. I decided to show up anyway, bringing a side dish and acting as if the invitation oversight had been an innocent mistake. When I walked into his backyard, Dad's expression shifted from surprise to obvious irritation. "Kelley, I don't remember inviting you to this," he said loudly enough for his guests to hear. "This is a gathering for people who understand business networking." I smiled politely and said I had assumed it was a family event, but Dad wasn't finished humiliating me in front of his professional contacts. "Kelley's never been able to follow simple instructions," he announced to the group, as if my presence was evidence of some cognitive limitation. "She just doesn't pick up on social cues the way other people do." His business partners looked uncomfortable with his public criticism of his own daughter, but Dad seemed energized by the opportunity to demonstrate his disappointment in me versus his pride in Cole. I smiled throughout his performance, knowing that this would be one of the last times he would feel comfortable treating me this way. The calm before the storm. We were back in Attorney Peterson's office for what Dad believed would be a routine inheritance meeting where he would formalize Cole's position as the sole beneficiary of my grandmother's estate. Dad announced with authority that he wanted to give the entire inheritance to Cole, explaining his reasoning as if it were obvious to everyone present. Cole sat beside him with the satisfied expression of someone who had never doubted this outcome, occasionally glancing at me with what looked like pity for my unfortunate position as the family disappointment. "Kelley has never shown the kind of judgment necessary for managing significant assets," Dad explained to Attorney Peterson, as if I weren't sitting right there listening to every word. "Cole has demonstrated business acumen and leadership abilities that make him the natural choice." Attorney Peterson nodded professionally while taking notes, but I could see him glancing at me with curiosity about how I was handling this public dismissal of my capabilities. Dad continued outlining his decision with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged on his assessment of his children's relative worth. That's when Attorney Peterson turned to me with a question that would change everything. "Kelley, do you have anything to present before we proceed with finalizing these arrangements?" Dad immediately scoffed at the attorney's question, his voice dripping with condescension. What could she possibly have to present? Kelley doesn't understand legal documents or financial planning. She's never shown interest in anything beyond her basic job responsibilities. Cole joined in with his own dismissive comment, "Yeah, Kelley's not really the type to prepare for these kinds of meetings. She usually just goes along with whatever Dad decides is best." Their confidence was absolute, built on 30 years of successfully convincing me that I was intellectually inferior to both of them. They had no idea that the quiet daughter they had dismissed had been building a case that would destroy their assumptions completely. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick folder containing every piece of evidence I had gathered over the past several months. Attorney Wilson had helped me organize everything into a presentation that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. "Actually, I do have some things to present," I said calmly, sliding the folder across the table toward Attorney Peterson. "I think everyone in this room should see what I've discovered about my grandmother's original wishes and how they'd been altered." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly as Dad's confident expression began to falter. I began presenting my evidence methodically, starting with the original trust documents that clearly named me as the primary beneficiary. Attorney Peterson examined each page carefully while Dad's face gradually drained of color. "These documents show that my grandmother specifically wanted me to inherit her estate," I explained, producing bank records that proved the trust was worth significantly more than Dad had claimed. She left detailed explanations about her reasoning, including her belief in my intellectual capacity and moral character. Cole's smirk died completely as he realized that his guaranteed inheritance was being challenged with actual legal documentation. Dad tried to interrupt several times, but Attorney Peterson held up his hand for silence while he reviewed the evidence. "Furthermore," I continued, "these documents show that the trust has been systematically altered after my grandmother's death, with forged signatures and falsified dates that constitute fraud." I presented the timeline of financial transfers, the hidden bank accounts, and the evidence that Dad had been stealing from the estate while positioning himself as the responsible executor managing a modest inheritance. Attorney Peterson's expression grew more serious with each document, and I could see him understanding the scope of the deception that had been carried out right under his nose. "I need to excuse myself to make a phone call," he said, gathering the evidence and leaving Dad and Cole to process what had just happened. Attorney Peterson returned to the conference room 20 minutes later with a completely different demeanor, accompanied by his law partner and a court clerk who had been contacted to witness what was about to happen. After reviewing Mrs. Hartman's evidence and consulting with the probate court, he announced, "I'm required to inform everyone that this inheritance proceeding cannot continue as originally planned." Dad exploded out of his chair, his face red with rage and panic. "This is nonsense. Those documents are fake. Kelley is trying to manipulate the system because she's bitter about being left out." "Mr. Hartman, please sit down," Attorney Peterson said firmly. "The court will need to honor the original will until a full investigation can be completed. The alterations Mrs. Kelley has documented appear to be forgeries." Cole started panicking, asking rapid-fire questions about what this meant for his expected inheritance and whether there was any way to challenge my evidence. But Attorney Peterson's next statement ended any doubt about the authenticity of what I had discovered. "The handwriting analysis confirms that these are your mother's original intentions, Frank. The documents you presented have been altered illegally." The room fell into stunned silence as the implications of criminal fraud began to sink in for both Dad and Cole. Cole immediately turned on Dad, his panic overriding any sense of family loyalty. "You told me this was all legal. You said Kelley was never supposed to inherit anything because she wasn't capable of handling it. She set us up." Dad shouted back, pointing at me accusingly. "This is some kind of elaborate scheme to steal what rightfully belongs to Cole." They began screaming at each other, each trying to blame the other for the situation they now found themselves in. Cole accused Dad of lying to him about the legal status of the inheritance, while Dad accused Cole of being ungrateful after everything he had done to secure his future. "I ruined my relationship with my own daughter for you," Dad yelled at Cole. "I spent years making sure you would get everything, and now you're attacking me when someone challenges it. You should have been honest with me about what Grandma actually wrote." Cole fired back. "Now we both look like criminals because of your stupid plan." I sat silently through their argument, watching years of shared deception crumble into mutual blame and accusations. The united front they had presented against me was collapsing as they realized the legal consequences they now faced. Their partnership in keeping me down was dissolving into the chaos they had created for themselves. Court day arrived with the kind of gray autumn weather that seemed appropriate for the reckoning that was about to unfold. The probate hearing would determine not just the inheritance question, but whether criminal charges would be filed against my father for fraud. Judge Martinez reviewed all the evidence while Dad and Cole sat at the defendant's table with their hastily hired attorney, who looked overwhelmed by the amount of documentation proving his client's guilt. Dad kept interrupting the proceedings, trying to explain his actions and justify his alterations of my grandmother's will. His outbursts grew more desperate as the judge reviewed each piece of evidence that demonstrated his years of deception. "Your Honor, my daughter has been planning this for months," Dad insisted during one particularly disruptive interruption. "She's manipulating the system because she's always been jealous of her brother's success." Judge Martinez's patience finally reached its limit. "Mr. Hartman, one more outburst and I will have you removed from this courtroom. You will remain silent while I review the evidence that has been presented." The courtroom fell into tense silence as the judge continued examining bank records, forged documents, and my grandmother's original handwritten will. Finally, Judge Martinez set down the papers and asked me to stand. "Mrs. Kelley Hartman, please approach the bench." Judge Martinez's voice carried the weight of legal authority as she delivered her verdict to the packed courtroom. After reviewing all evidence presented, including handwriting analysis, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses, this court finds that the original will of Mrs. Eleanor Hartman is valid and legally binding. She paused, allowing the implications to sink in before continuing with the decision that would change my life forever. Therefore, Kelley Hartman is hereby declared the sole beneficiary of the Eleanor Hartman estate, including all properties, financial assets, and business interests as specified in the original trust documents. Cole's jaw fell open as he processed the reality that his guaranteed inheritance had just been awarded to the sister he had spent years dismissing as intellectually inferior. Dad slumped back in his chair, the color draining from his face as he realized that his years of manipulation had been completely undone. The judge wasn't finished with her ruling, however. The evidence I had presented had revealed crimes that extended beyond simple inheritance fraud. Additionally, Judge Martinez continued, "This court is ordering a full investigation into the document alterations and financial irregularities that have been brought to light during these proceedings." The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations as people realized that the inheritance reversal was just the beginning of Dad's legal troubles. Judge Martinez outlined the additional consequences that would result from the investigation into Dad's illegal activities. Mr. Frank Hartman will face criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and embezzlement of estate assets. The district attorney's office will determine the specific charges after reviewing all evidence. Dad's attorney tried to minimize the potential penalties, but the judge made it clear that the scope of his crimes could result in significant prison time and financial penalties. But Cole's situation was about to become even worse than his lost inheritance. Judge Martinez had discovered something during her review of the financial records that no one had anticipated. "Mr. Cole Hartman," she said, addressing my brother directly, "the court has determined that you received financial benefits from the fraudulent management of this estate. You will be responsible for repaying those amounts with interest." Cole learned that the business debts Dad had hidden while managing the estate were now his responsibility, since he had been the intended beneficiary of the fraud. The money he had received over the years based on his expected inheritance would have to be returned, plus penalties. Furthermore, the judge concluded, both defendants are prohibited from contacting the beneficiary except through legal counsel regarding the restitution arrangements. My father and brother were not only losing the inheritance they had stolen, but facing criminal prosecution and financial ruin as consequences of their years of deception. After the hearing ended, Cole approached me in the courthouse hallway with the kind of desperate expression I had never seen on his face before. "Kelley, you have to be reasonable about this. We're family. Dad made mistakes, but you can't destroy us over money." His plea for mercy came after 30 years of participating in my systematic humiliation, and I found myself unmoved by his sudden recognition of our family connection. Dad joined him in trying to manipulate me into forgiveness, his tone shifting from anger to self-pity. "Kelley, everything I did was to protect this family's future. You owe me some gratitude for the sacrifices I made raising you and your brother." The audacity of his demand for gratitude was breathtaking. He was asking me to thank him for stealing my inheritance while convincing me I was too stupid to deserve it. I walked past them without speaking, my silence more powerful than any argument I could have made. They had spent years telling me that my voice didn't matter, so I was giving them the absence of communication they had taught me was appropriate. As I reached the courthouse doors, Attorney Peterson approached with one final envelope that would complete my understanding of what my grandmother had actually intended for my future. Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter that my grandmother had sealed with specific instructions that it only be opened after the legal proceedings were complete. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, and the words were addressed specifically to me. "My dearest Kelley," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that my fears about your father's character were justified, and you have had to fight for what I intended to give you freely." Tears filled my eyes as I read her explanation of why she had chosen me as her primary beneficiary. "You have always possessed the mind and heart of a true leader, even when others failed to recognize your qualities. Your intelligence has never been about showing off or demanding attention, but about observing, learning, and understanding the world with wisdom beyond your years." She had seen through my father's favoritism and understood that my quiet nature represented strength rather than weakness. The others in our family mistake volume for intelligence and aggression for leadership. You understand that true strength often operates in silence until the moment arrives to act decisively. The letter concluded with a prediction that had proven accurate. "Your father will try to steal what I'm leaving you, but I believe you have the intelligence and determination to reclaim what is rightfully yours. The quiet ones often surprise everyone with what they're capable of achieving." I signed the final ownership papers with hands that no longer trembled, finally understanding that someone in my family had always believed in me. 6 months later, I had taken complete control of the estate and begun transforming everything my father had damaged through years of negligent management. I modernized the business operations, paid off all debts that Cole had inherited as a result of Dad's fraud, and restored the financial stability that my grandmother had worked her entire life to build. The inheritance had given me independence, but more importantly, it had validated my intelligence in ways that changed how I saw myself. I was no longer the dismissed daughter who accepted other people's assessments of my limitations. Dad and Cole never contacted me again after the court ordered them to communicate only through attorneys regarding their restitution payments. They had learned that the quiet strength they had mistaken for weakness was actually the kind of intelligence that wins when it matters most. I used my grandmother's resources to start a foundation that supported young women whose families underestimated their potential. The work was deeply satisfying, helping others recognize their worth when the people closest to them failed to see their value. My story ends with a message for anyone who has been told they're not smart enough, capable enough, or worthy enough to succeed. Never let anyone else define your intelligence. Quiet strength is still strength, and sometimes it's exactly the kind that wins when the moment arrives to prove who you really are. I walked away from that courthouse free from the family that had spent 30 years convincing me I was less than I was, finally understanding that their opinion had never been about my actual capabilities.